Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you everyone for coming in today to the Danube Institute. My name is Callum Nicholson. I'm Director of Research here at the Institute. For those of you who've not been here before, and there's some new faces, the Danube Institute is a think tank that works on a whole range of different issues, mostly geopolitical, but we do a lot of other stuff as well. We produce a research paper every week. We do an event like this at the rate of 1 or 2 a week. We do podcasts and videocasts almost every week. And we have a range of visiting fellows. A few of them are currently in the audience. Indeed, Eric is one of our senior and long-standing visiting fellows. So today's event, Europe's Battle Over the Meaning of Democracy, is going to be moderated by Eric Hendricks, and I'm going to hand it over to him to introduce the topic and the panelists and the structure. But just to say, with our institute, you're always welcome. Come back to any of our events. Watch our videos on YouTube. We also have a Substack based in Budapest, which is not only informative, but quite funny. So I'll leave it to Eric now. Eric.
Thank you so much, Callum, for the introduction. I'm excited to be here and welcome these two speakers. So I'm a visiting fellow here. My name is Erik Hendricks. I'm a visiting fellow from the Netherlands. I was born in Amsterdam. And today we have Philip Manow from the University of Siegen and Stefan Auer from the University of Hong Kong. Philip Manow is one of Germany's leading political theorists. He's a very modest man, so he wouldn't put it like that. But I would even say that I think a lot of people are of the opinion that Professor Manow, you are the most interesting German political theorist at this moment. And Stefan Auer is a European Studies professor. And his latest book is European Disunion, which made quite a splash. And Philip Manow's latest book is Unter Beobachtung, Under Observation, where he writes about the evaluation of democracy, the discourses, the evaluative discourses, normative discourses surrounding democracy. So our topic today is the battle over the meaning of democracy. Now you might wonder, how is there a battle? Isn't it clear what democracy is? It's just that certain people just don't like democracy or are pushing for the wrong things. Well, we're going to do a bit of a paradigm shift here. The meaning of democracy is, of course, highly contested. It's not clear, even though in mundane political discourse, it's going to seem as if it's clear what democracy means. It is actually a highly contested concept. And this is the case with all of the most important concepts in our political discourse. Our political and intellectual life centers on deeply contested concepts. It's democracy, rule of law, nationhoods, European solidarity. All of these are concepts that are on a very fundamental level disputed. It's not exactly clear what they mean, or it's not that politics starts with an agreement on these concepts, on what these terms mean, and then moves on towards the discussion. No, the meaning of the concepts itself is under discussion. And what is also under discussion is the nature of the disagreement. What you'll have is in Europe we have different ideological formations that sketch a certain picture of the political self and a picture of the political other. And with these ideological formations come evaluative frameworks, democracy indices that rank countries as to how democratic they are, with their own interpretive categories and labels. And these interpretive categories and labels are themselves politicized. Finally, these different ideological formations in Europe have their own historiographies, their own senses and interpretations of 21st century and 20th century history. Hannah Arendt, the famous philosopher, said, "Europe is the heir to many pasts." Now, I'm from the Netherlands, so I've really come from Amsterdam, from a very progressive liberal world, and I worked at the University of Bonn in Western Germany before I came here to Budapest. So I've really seen both of these worlds from the inside. Now, if we'd have this discussion about the meaning of democracy in Amsterdam or at the University of Bonn or with Professor Manow at the University of Siegen, the difficult part would be to explain that in Visegrad countries, among conservatives, in Hungary, there might be a legitimate concept of democracy that differs from liberal conceptions of democracy in Western Europe. But here in Budapest, the challenge may be the reverse. It may be that you assume that it's clear that we know what democracy means. It means that the majority gets to say, gets to determine the outcome. The majority elects a certain leadership, and then it's the technocrats in the European Commission that are obviously an authoritarian threat to democracy. So here we would have the typical discussion that Professor Manow will have in Siegen and that I had at the University of Bonn. We'll come at it here from the opposite direction. So here it might be controversial that there is a liberal. So I shouldn't speak too much about the content. I shouldn't take away too much of the substance of the matter. But in Europe, in the liberal West, there is a conception of democracy which includes very heavily, very centrally, a certain notion of rule of law, and many of the things that are actually constraints on majoritarian power are seen as essential parts of democracy. Whereas conservatives in the Visegrad countries will tend to see the majoritarian rule as democratic and see these legalistic constitutional constraints on democracy as constraints and not as essential parts of democracy. So we'll get to that. But let me say this about our speakers before we start. Our speakers their books are so good that I gave a tour through China. I went to various European studies institutes in China. I got invited to talk about European politics, and instead of having to work out my own theories and doing much work, I just took their latest books and sort of popularized them, and that was that gave me enough material to give 7 talks in China in the autumn, and those talks I titled all of these talks "The Philosophical Foundations of the European Culture War." But before we start, just one little note: what I called the European Culture War when I was introducing these concepts in European Studies departments in China is actually probably by now a Western Culture War, because the American Culture War and the European Culture War have really reconnected, and especially via Hungary, via conservatism in Hungary, via the Danube Institute. So here, where we're located here is an intersection point between the European and the American Culture War, where increasingly the ideological formations in European political thought map onto ideological formations in the United States, I would argue. But that's something to keep in mind. And without further ado, I give the floor to Professor Manow. Please give a round of applause to Professor Manow. Oh, doch. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Good afternoon to everybody. Thanks a lot for having me here. We agreed I will speak around 15, maybe a little bit to 20 minutes. Then Stefan Auer will follow up, and then we will quite likely open the debate to the audience and have a general discussion. So I'm very happy to be here, and since my time is limited, I will just jump into medias res. So from a political science perspective, we would like, if we talk about democracy, we would like to measure it. And I don't know how familiar you are with the debate, but one of the most influential and most standard-setting institute which measures democracy is the Varieties of Democracy Institute in Stockholm. And here especially its Liberal Democracy Index has become highly influential, especially in the annual democracy reports of the Wiedem Institute coming out each spring and measuring worldwide the state of democracy. And so this is that's the setup of my short intervention. I will first speak a little bit about the typology behind these measurements, then I will talk about the index, and then I will talk about the structural change of democracy in the last 30, 40 years. Now, if we start with the typology which has become dominant, and I think it's very important to point out when it came dominant, in linking up to what Eric said about the history of our notions of democracy. It came around 2014, 2015. The first annual report of the Wiedem Institute came out, I think, in 2016. So, as you can imagine, it was already in the time of the rise of populism. It was in the year of Brexit and the first Trump election, so to speak. So it was already in a context where democracy seemed to be endangered from within and not anymore from outside after the triumph of democracy from 1990 onwards, like Fukuyama would tell the story. So around this time, we see a new typology coming up and becoming dominant, whereas before we had mainly binary typologies like dictatorship versus democracy, autocracy versus democracy, or free versus non-free states, and then always a kind of in-between category. Here we now get a fourfold typology. So we have two types of autocracies and we have two types of democracies. And then we get the within distinction of two types of democracy, an electoral democracy and a liberal democracy. And as you might already get from this scheme, and the underlying arrows and the color psychology underlying it, going from red to green or going from green back to red, so from processes of democratization and processes of autocratization, you already get the impression of a new understanding of democracies as a developmental scheme. And then you have a higher order of democracy, namely a liberal democracy, and you have a democracy of lower dignity, the electoral democracy, which then always is in danger of flipping into electoral autocracy and then maybe even into a closed autocracy. I think if you really think about a kind of sociology of knowledge, I think it's very important and revealing that exactly around the same time, 2017, in this famous book by Carsten Müdde and Rovira Kaltwasser, A Short Introduction to Populism, you see exactly the same scheme coming up. It's a fourfold typology. Again, it's a kind of developmental understanding of democracy. And again, these are processes of democratization or de-democratization, so meaning autocratization. And again, you have the impression the liberal democracy is the higher type, is the more advanced, it's the more mature, it's the more maybe stable. So you get this understanding of it's a kind of modernization theory. So you see a developmental path towards the new Jerusalem, namely the liberal democracy, and not only the electoral democracy. So this kind of typology has many problems, but I will stick to four of them. So, interestingly, if you look at the annual democracy report of 2020, 24, and if you just simply look at page 46 and 47, you will see a kind of statement of 4 of the PIs, of the principal investigators of the Wiedem project, having a kind of minority statement within the report where they say that the dramatic diagnosis about autocratization ruling the world and about the demise of democracy, where they contradict this kind of gloom and doom perspective. It's very interesting, and where you see internal debates within the institute, where 4 of these PIs say no, the state of democracy is not as bad as the annual reports tend us to suggest. And one of the criticisms is that this focus on the liberal regime type is much too demanding, and it has a very crisp categories. So that this already is in the danger of giving a false impression. There was a special issue on perspectives on politics in early 2024, which pointed to the fact that many of the democracy data generated by expert surveys, asking people like me, was in contradistinction to objective measures of democracy, where the subjective measures by expert surveys showed a kind of decline of liberal democracy. The objective measures, for instance, whether elections function as a device of allocating power and also of withdrawing power, that these kind of empirics, these different empirics, became more and more contradictory, because the subjective measures showed a kind of decline, whereas the objective measures didn't. And so one of the suggestions in that special issue of Perspectives on Politics was, or it might be even, I think it might be the annual review of political science, that maybe we are confronted with the problem of collective coder bias, so that all these experts, all being in mainly Western universities, all reading the same papers, all have the same perspective on the crisis of democracy, whereas the democracy itself might not be in such deep water. But what I want to highlight here is that the typology has the problem that cannot be the case that you have too much liberalism. So in this, what you don't have here conceptually as a possibility, that you have too much liberalism. That's precluded. That cannot be. So, and if, as we will see, the liberal character of democracy lies in on the constraints on the electoral elements of democracy, then following these conceptions, it cannot be the case that you have anywhere too much liberalism. That's simply not. It's not conceivable within this framework of thinking. So now you might think, okay, that might be the case, or that might be the problem of this typology, but I want to show you now that this is the problem of the measurement itself. So because we have to distinguish between the regime typology and the index itself. The index, the Wiedem Institute the project has several indexes, like participatory democracy, deliberative democracy, egalitarian democracy. But again, also in the presentation and in the public relation, so to speak, the liberal democracy index is the most important, and it's also the index which mostly supports a diagnosis of crisis of democracy. So, the two prominent indexes of the institute are the Liberal Democracy Index and the Electoral Democracy Index. Now, I try not to become too technically, but from my perspective, what is really important is that already on these, not on the typology, on the regime typology, autocracy versus democracy, closed autocracy, electoral autocracy, not on the regime typology level, but on the measurement level of the index itself, exactly the same happens, and you can see it here mathematically, since the liberal democracy index is a composite index. It has the electoral inside. So the electoral is simply, it's free elections. Of course, it's then the freedom of association. It's the freedom of expression. Of course, that also implies that you have an independent judiciary where you can protect and defend these freedoms. So this is the electoral. But then on top of that comes the liberal component, and the liberal component are judicial and legislative constraints on the executive and protection of civil liberties and equality before the law. So, but you already see it mathematically in the formula. The liberal always comes on top of the electoral. That also means, and that's exactly the same. It cannot happen. Mathematically it cannot happen that the liberal ever would reduce the quality of the electoral. So, and then I've just I just showed it here in a figure on different levels of the electoral, which is here on the x-axis. Different levels of the liberal would only ever make the democracy always better. It can never be the case that we will have a tension between the electoral and the liberal. But we know that there are tensions, and there is a huge literature showing that these are not, that we have situations where constraints on the executive, judicial mainly, would constrain an executive to such a degree or in so matters that the democratic quality of responsiveness of the electoral quality of a democracy would suffer. So that's very obvious. So you can do it as a thought experiment. If judicial constraints on the executive are so strong that it's completely without relevance whether party A governs or whether party B governs, then it's quite obvious that there is a contradiction or a tension between the liberal, which are the constraints on the executive, and the electoral, which then would be popular sovereignty and electoral responsibility and responsiveness. So we have a huge literature showing us that there is a tension, and the Liberal Democracy Index of the Danube Institute simply denies that there is any problem at all. And I think that's an untenable position. It's an ideological position in a certain sense, and I think it invalidates the index itself. It shouldn't be used, and we shouldn't put our diagnosis of democracy's state on this index. So the problem becomes especially acute since the factual constraints on the executive have developed dramatically over the last 40 years. So I simply show you now a couple of graphs showing the spread of constitutional review worldwide. So this is worldwide, countries with constitutional courts which have the right of judicial review, meaning being able to constrain the executive. And we see that around 1990, Hungary is a very prominent case, the judicial constraints on the executive just exploded. And this is true for the world, but this is also true especially for Europe. So these are the countries where we have then from 1989 to 99, where we have then constitutional courts with the ability for judicial review. And also, and this is even more problematic in the European case, since we have the German tradition of constitutional courts and not the Supreme Court tradition of the Anglo-Saxon world, or especially the US or maybe sometimes Israel, we have the opportunity that members of parliament can initiate judicial review, which makes it, of course, much more politicized, the whole process. And sometimes they can even initiate judicial review with a very, very, very low quota. So as far as I am informed, the Hungarian constitution before 2011 allowed one single Hungarian MP in the Hungarian parliament to initiate a judicial review. So now what we then have, and if you talk about the different battles of the meaning of democracy in Europe, we usually have the saying, okay, and this is a famous quote by Christoph Möllers, a very, very prominent German constitutional lawyer, saying, well, liberalism and democracy are not in tension with each other because they always appear together. So if liberalism and democracy are in tension, why is it that at present there are neither liberal democracies nor undemocratic liberal constitutional states to be found anywhere in the world? Where are the systems with free elections but without independent courts open to all? And where are the systems with an independent judiciary but without an open political process? So that's this kind of rhetorical question. But if we look at Europe, or if you generally look at the interface between national democracies and transnational, international agencies, especially, of course, courts, then we would say, no, Christoph Möllers, there is, for instance, in Europe, there is a case where we have a rule of law system. So we have a very independent judiciary, maybe even too independent, but we don't have a very strong democratic process or responsibility, and that would be the European Union. And that means also that the special problem which the VDEM concept doesn't get into view is exactly the interface between national processes of democratic legitimation through elections, so that's the electoral democracy index, so to speak, and then the relation to the supranational, which in all kinds is always illegal. It's integration by law. It's always a legal mechanism, but not a democratic one, since, as you all know, the Commission is not elected in free and open and, equally elections. So that's what I did. Interestingly, the VDEM project itself doesn't measure the democratic quality of the European Union. I measured them on both dimensions, on the liberal component index and also on the electoral democracy index. Of course, on the liberal component index, constraints on the executive, we can rank them as 1, so the full index, so to speak. But as we know, since the executive office is not filled by free and open and fair elections, it ranked much lower on the electoral index. And so in a way, we have exactly the case which Christoph Möller says isn't existent in the world. Okay, let's stop here. And so my conclusion would be the liberal democracy index doesn't, as a matter of principle, rules out that there ever can be such a thing like a liberal overstretch. It can also not, really acknowledge the problems of democracy occurring between the national and the supranational. And it then also neglects or ignores the very fundamental transformation of the real world transformation of democracy in the last 30 years, which has been a constitutional revolution, so to speak, a constitutionalization of democracy in the third wave of democratization. And then it can also not get to the possibility that what we see as and what we call populism might be a kind of liberal democratic response to undemocratic liberalism. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. It's an enormous pleasure and privilege to be here. I want to thank Eric for initiating this. I mean, one way of thinking about democracy is that the vital ingredients for any thriving democracy is debate. And I think Danube Institute is a place for open debates. And we need people like Eric who convene debates of thinkers who might not agree on everything. But in this case, I am actually in strong agreement with Professor Manow. I feel very honored to be on the same panel. Your work is the source of my inspiration. My presentation will be less scientific to the extent that I'm not going to present diagrams and statistics. I will simplify some of the claims that you presented and perhaps also complicate them because I'm in full agreement about the serious threat to democracy that emerges, particularly at the EU level, from the power of non-majoritarian institutions. And in some ways, my book could be summarized in those terms. But I also want to echo the observation that Eric made in his kind introductory remarks, that the conversation is kind of split. In Western Europe, the problem really is that there is too much liberalism. So I found that striking what you said, right? That the model that they use doesn't even allow for that. That can be a problem. Non-majoritarian institutions being ever more powerful, right? But in this part of the world, in Central Europe, and if you are wondering about my accent, my name sounds German, but I am from Czechoslovakia, from the Slovak Republic. So I am very interested in Central Europe. I find it disturbing, frankly, that liberalism in this part of Europe became something of a swear word. I think it's not a healthy development. So perhaps in this part of Europe, it is good to reclaim the virtues of liberalism, and that is, to a great extent, the aim of my presentation. So I will start by echoing what Philip Manow just said. Democracy in Europe is not to be confused with European democracy. In fact, European democracy has undermined democracy in Europe. That's the story I try to sketch in European Disunion that I'm advertising there on the slide. And thanks again, Eric, for showing interest in it. There's no such thing as a European democracy because there is no European demos. There is Czech democracy, German democracy, French democracy, Polish democracy, even Hungarian democracy, I dare say, but not a European democracy. And of course, scholars of European integration have been telling us that I'm wrong in contrasting the two. Europe is an experimental union, unsettled and unsettling, a democracy that is a democracy of democracies. But all these approaches, in my view, have been proven wrong, and I hope that I show it quite convincingly in that book. And I don't want to actually restate the key arguments of the book. I want to present ideas that I'm developing as I'm finishing a kind of sequel to the last book. That's the Europe at War, the fight for EU's eastern border. I will not talk that much about the fight as war, but the fight over democracy. So, to start with, maybe the puzzle is not so much that democracy is in trouble, but rather that it has lasted for as long as it has. And Professor Manow actually nicely outlined that there are inherent tensions in the project, right? There are two contradictory impulses that drive the project. It's the commitment to freedom and equality. So liberalism, right, and equal votes. The idea of self-government, but self-government of whom? The people, right? The people is an elusive category even at best times. Today, it's even more so, right? And that's just one aspect of Philip Manow's work, which I find utterly compelling, the way in which you show, and it showed in this presentation, that democratic accountability has been, in fact, eroded by non-majoritarian institutions, such as constitutional courts, whose purpose is meant to be to make democracy work. So liberalism can actually damage democratic or undermine democratic promise, undermine democratic impulse. And in Europe, this tendency has been further reinforced by the process of Europeanization, the result of which is that more and more areas of public policy are moved to the supranational level, the control of which by electorates is greatly reduced, right? That's the key story of my book. And this is what I attempted to describe. The democracy at national level was undermined by the push towards an ever closer union without any meaningful compensation at the European level. And of course, the federalists will tell us that there is a possibility of compensation, but I think they are simply wrong. That compensation at the European level is neither feasible nor desirable. So that's the gist of it, of my last book. But we live even in more dramatic times than the ones that dominated the world before at the time I wrote my book. And we are even more aware of the fragility of democracy. But that awareness is not new. And that awareness is actually not limited to conservative political thought. I was reminded of Richard Rorty, a brilliant American, late Richard Rorty, a liberal ironist, who argued already in the 1990s that democracy was not our destiny. That was not the popular view, right? It was quite at odds with Fukuyama. And Rorty is coming to this from a left-wing perspective. He thought that democracy existed, as a fleeting moment. He imagined that democracy might exist as a fleeting moment, and then it was no longer. It was a lucky accident of history. And yet it was worth fighting for, Rorty argued. Achieving Our Country was the title of one of his books, which is also a political program. It is a statement in favor of liberal nationalism, which is not that common amongst left-wing intellectuals. And he wasn't as vulgar as to call for making America great again, but he called for achieving our country, right? Something that the left forgot matters. And obviously he was not enough of a European, he was not a European to call for making Europe great again. But he was onto something there. He understood better than many liberals then and now that for democracy to work, you need a political community. That's the problem that the EU faces and has no viable solution to. The question is how you get it and how can it be sustained. And that question becomes way more compelling at the age in Europe where we see a very potent security threat from revanchist, from imperialist Russia. I'll cite a scholar who is usually controversial in Germany, but hugely influential and very insightful, Carl Schmitt, a horrible Nazi, but a brilliant political thinker. And he argued that only a democracy, only a nation capable of defending itself will survive. Drawing on Thomas Hobbes, he said, the protego ergo obligo is the cogito ergo sum of the state. Those who protect obligate. It's the Hobbesian lesson that Schmitt sought to restate for the 20th century. The horrible regime which he supported, Nazi Germany, didn't deliver on that promise. But that doesn't invalidate the doctrine. Only democracy able of defending itself can survive. And only a democracy that has enough unity within it would be able to deliver on that. That is the drama of liberal democracy. And that leads me to interest in conservative liberalism, I want to call it, for the lack of a better word. And this is now my attempt to reclaim liberalism. And it's partly inspired by an event I attended here in Budapest in November last year at MCC, where a brilliant young scholar, Gabor Megadia, argued that liberal democracy is a form of tyranny. I think he went way too far, right? He extrapolated from some insane ideas by a great public intellectual, Yuval Harari, a best-selling author, right, and a liberal, who argued, for example, that death is a crime against humanity and we ought to wage total war against it. We should all become immortal. I think that's insane, basically. But Harari happens to be liberal, so then the argument was, you see, liberals are crazy, they are woke, they want to abolish mortality, therefore liberalism is insane. I think we shouldn't go that far, that fast. What liberals like Richard Rorty may well have underestimated, though, is the question of meaning. Meaning of our lives and the meaning of our political communities. The question that liberal ironies and contemporary liberals more generally have eschewed as the purpose, is the purpose of that political construct. What is democracy good for? Delivering on the best outcome for the people who have decided to rule themselves. That's a more straightforward description. But what does it entail? It's this and more. But that more cannot be captured. In fact, it cannot be even discussed without considering the conception of the good life, a discussion that liberals tend to dismiss as irrelevant. But perhaps I should say many or most contemporary liberals tend to dismiss it. Because if you look back at liberal traditions, and I look at Immanuel Kant, Edmund Burke, Alexis de Tocqueville, the contemporary reading of Tocqueville by Harvey Mansfield, they articulate different versions of liberalism with a soul. So liberalism that has a robust commitment to a certain set of values. So Kant, for example, is oftentimes misquoted and misrepresented as this kind of guy who said that there can be universal peace because we are all fundamentally good. You need to go back to Kant to read him to see that that's just a misrepresentation. It's Kant, also Immanuel Kant, who said that from such a crooked wood as man is made of, nothing perfectly straight will ever be made. So Kant understood and accepted the insights of Thomas Hobbes, and his liberalism is not that utopian as it's often presented. So I am arguing in favor of a robust commitment to liberal democracy, but that commitment should be tempered by the realization that we are not perfect as humans. We need to constrain power. So that's why liberal democracy has a lot going for it. We need to temper political power, as my friend Martin Krieger calls it, a brilliant Australian scholar of constitutionalism. But we need more than that. We need what Alexis de Tocqueville described as liberalism with a soul. This is one strand of liberalism worth reviving. Roger Scruton is very popular in Budapest, and I'm thrilled to see that. He is my hero too. But Roger Scruton, of course, he self-describes as a conservative, but he too attempted to revive liberalism. One of my favorite essays, published in New Criterion, a conservative journal, is his attempt to demolish Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and he does it very effectively, brilliant writer that he is. But the title of the series in which it appears is called The Betrayal of Liberalism. This crazy utopian liberalism that Yuval Harari brings up to date is not the only liberal tradition that we have. And particularly in this part of Europe, the conservative tradition might be more appealing. The conservative tradition that is based around the notion of the care for the soul, a concept that can be traced back all the way to Plato and Aristotle. It was Aristotle, even more than Plato, of course, who was a political philosopher and stressed that man is a political animal. So I'm doing something crazy here in 10 minutes, from Aristotle via Kant to Yuval Harari, but spare with me, be patient. This is, for me, a new discovery. The book is not that new, but it was just reissued with a new introduction, and I find it really fascinating. It is an attempt to restate this kind of conservative liberalism, and you have it even in the title, The Growth of the Liberal Soul, and David Walsh does draw actually on Aristotle, on Nietzsche, and he talks about friendship, the way Aristotle described it in the Nicomachean Ethics, which is in friendship that he sees the growth of a political animal, right? And it's one of the prerequisites then for a political community to emerge. It is in relation to others, David Walsh writes, that we become more fully who we are and discover the reciprocal bond that unites us in the adventure of freedom. We are free only with others. That is also Arendtian republican ideal of freedom. So friendship matters there. As I said, building on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Walsh further writes, it is the moment when, in becoming conscious of myself, I'm also conscious of the existence of my friend and of his consciousness of my existence. So that kind of interactive, right, dimension is absolutely vital for the very ideal of freedom. And that is in stark contrast with some dominant strands of liberalism that emphasize, that are built around excessive individualism, right? That you are free on your own. And the way David Walsh discusses the growth of the liberal soul as something of a philosophical project echoes the insights of a brilliant Czech dissident intellectual who is not that well known. He should be better known. His writing style is not that accessible. Jan Patočka, a great influence on Václav Havel, and he in turn was influenced by Hannah Arendt and Martin Heidegger. And he thought of Europe and the European project as the care for the soul. He talked about the solidarity of the shattered. He was banned by communist authorities most of his life. And he talked about the solidarity of the shattered, solidarity of those who are capable of understanding what life and death are all about. And consequently also what history is all about. That history is this conflict of mere life, naked and constrained by fear, with life at the peak. Life that does not plan for the future ordinary days, but sees clearly that ordinary day is life and peace come to an end. This is the kind of ideal of republican virtue, echoing Arendt there, right? That the only way of truly human existence, realization of human potential, is to be a political being, is to be a part of the polity, and that is the only place where freedom can be realized. And that takes me back to the Danube Institute, because what is the context in which these kind of virtues, republican virtues, civic virtues, that make freedom possible, can emerge and can thrive? What is the context? For me, it's obvious that it is only within a national community that can happen. But there is a European dimension to it, but not the one that the EU is providing us with. And that takes me to a project that my esteemed friend launched here at the Danube Institute last November, right? Or December it was? December. David Dusenberry. And the paper that they co-wrote with Philip Pilkington, talking about the era of re-civilization. So I think there is a European dimension to the project of European of democracy in Europe, but its natural, logical home is at the level of nation states. So in my book, I argue basically in favor of a Europe of nation state, Europe of nation states. But I realize that the very idea of civilization, let alone re-civilization, and may I draw your attention to the fact that David Dusenberry presented this project before Marco Rubio gave his speech in Munich, right, at the security conference, echoing some of these arguments. And we had a conversation with Eric here yesterday that it doesn't seem obvious that the erratic and the vain president that the United States currently has, Donald Trump, is the most obvious agent of re-civilization, right, for Europeans. And yet, I think there is a lot to that ideal, particularly the way that David Dusenberry articulated it. And I was thrilled to see that the recording of that session that was presented here was just released. So the argument I'm making is that the civic virtues that make democracy work can be developed and sustained at the national level, but that there are obvious also European or even Western dimensions to it that we should not be ashamed to reclaim. We should be proud of our traditions. And that takes me back to Patočka, and that's the last slide I have here. Again, the solidarity of the shattered and the care for the soul. And Patočka is a fascinating figure that in his philosophical standpoint echoes Richard Rorty, right? These guys were committed to the project of modernity and felt that it is no longer possible to have an unproblematic relationship to the Western tradition. He talked about Rorty talks about non-foundational commitment to liberalism, and Patočka, as a student of Edmund Husserl and Heidegger and Hannah Arendt, shared that position. But he also sensed very clearly, very strongly, that there is something elusive and yet hugely important that makes democracy worthwhile and makes democracy worth fighting for. That there are moral values we inherit from the Western tradition that cannot be forgotten, and it must be reclaimed even more so when we are faced with the threat of technocracy. That is a whole dimension of EU governance I didn't discuss. So that quote, I think, captures it. No society, no matter how well equipped it may be technologically, and this is a text from the late 1970s. He's not talking about the AI and all the advances that no one could have imagined then. No society, no matter how well equipped it may be technologically, can function without a moral foundation, without convictions that do not depend on convenience, circumstances, or expected advantage. So this is the kind of crude, selfish, individualistic liberalism, which is the betrayal of liberalism, that he captures then in the first sentence. The idea of human rights, of course, which is at the heart of the liberal project. The idea of human rights is nothing other than the conviction that even states, even society as a whole, are subject to the sovereignty of moral sentiment, that they recognize something unconditional that is higher than they are, something that is binding even on them, sacred, invaluable. So I'll leave it at that. I hope there is enough there to discuss further. Thanks again for this opportunity.
Thanks for that. I'm going to before we go to the Q&A, and there will be a lot of room for questions and comments. I'm going to try to help out some of the members of the audience for whom the last two talks, as well as my introduction, were a little bit conceptually dense. When I introduced the speakers, I was hoping with my introduction to provide an accessible, easily understandable introduction, but halfway through my introduction I realized that my supposedly accessible introduction itself was rather challenging, and then came to intellectually and academically very demanding talks. I think a key variable here is that all three of us have been intellectually socialized in the German humanities. Of course, Professor Manow is a professor in German academia. Stefan Auer studied in Germany before he moved to Australia. Now he's working in Hong Kong, and I did my PhD in Germany. So in German humanities are very theoretical. So let me make one last chance to step back and give something of make an attempt to make this slightly more comprehensible, what we're discussing here. Remember a few years ago when the European Parliament declared that Hungary was no longer a full democracy, but was instead an electoral autocracy, right? So that was an interesting move, because a lot of people in Hungary and a lot of conservatives throughout Europe said, that's strange. So the European Union thinks that the Hungarian government is not fully democratic, but the European Parliament is very remote from the national democracies. It's a transnational entity, and it's very remote. It feels very remote from ordinary European citizens and voters. And then the European Commission is not elected at all. So there is this European Union technocracy. It's liberal and technocratic. It's not very democratic. It has a democratic deficiency. And here it's lecturing the Hungarian government. Now the terminology was interesting as well. Electoral autocracy, right? And then, as Professor Manow explained, so you have the in this scheme you have the autocracy, right? That's really bad. Then you have the electoral autocracy, so it's also bad, but it has some democratic elements. Then you have the electoral democracy. Then you think, oh, that should be the full picture. No, there's the liberal democracy, which is better than the electoral democracy. So the idea is, Professor Manow discussed it, that the more liberal you are, the more constitutional restraint you have, the more legalistic you approach things, the more democratic you are. But that's not the case, because you can have a tension between the will of the people, right? What's popular in the electorate, what elected politicians want to enact, and the outcome of complex legal transnational structures, treaty structures, right? You can have a tension between those things. And the European Union shows this, right? So the European Union is supposed to be like the high point of democracy from a certain liberal technocratic view of democracy. But if you're looking at it from a more conservative point of view, or more Visegrad point of view, more Hungarian point of view, you will say, okay, they're not so democratic at all. Viktor Orban won all these elections, so he is obviously the most democratic. So this was my attempt to to make it. This is my second attempt at making an introduction to the issue, the battle over the meaning of democracy. And then, as I understood, Stefan Auer, right? So Stefan Auer said he agreed with this analysis, and he's in favor. He's a European studies professor, and he's a lover of Europe. But he doesn't think the European Union gets better by just being more centralized and federalistic. He believes in a European Union of nation states, right? More of a confederate structure. So he agreed with the analysis of Professor Manow, but he wanted to salvage liberalism. He said, okay, there are some understandings of liberalism that do not go into this technocratic variant that we have right now, and it drives people in the European Parliament to label Hungary, for example, a electoral autocracy, whatever that means. And then finally, he was arguing as well for a certain European spiritedness, rooted in an understanding of an awareness of the importance of European civilization, which is different from a European technocratic, centralistic, bureaucratic program, right? So this is my very humble attempt to make it slightly comprehensible. But it's, of course, we've hit so many different notes, we've hit so many different topics. Now we'll turn to the Q&A, unless Professor Manow, you would want to have a first response to Professor Auer. No, then we'll turn to the Q&A, and we've opened up so many fascinating facets. This is, I believe, this is the most important political ideological matter of our times. It's the most important issue. I think the topics we discussed here are the central issues of Europe's ideological contestation. This is the philosophical foundation of the big picture in my point of view. So I'm sure you will have questions and comments directed at the speakers. I'll turn first to my Brazilian colleague Stefano, who's also Italian and a European studies scholar.
Thank you very much, Eric. I actually have two questions. I would say one for each lecture. The first question is, I would say a more general one about the concept of militant democracy by Karl Löwenstein, that I see being used more and more, even in these exact words, by the European Commission itself, and it was presenting its so-called democracy shield, and it was most recently used in some press communiques by the French government. So I would like to know how do you assess the growth in popularity within institutional spheres of this concept, and whether you believe that it may become a sort of, if not a replacement, a complementary concept to that of liberal democracy, or perhaps a substitute there too. My second question is more directed to the issue of the constitutional courts and judicial reviews. Coming from Brazil, which has a tradition of a very politicized Supreme Court, I personally always saw the constitutional court as a more independent, more almost insulated form of judicial authority, and I used to see this as a positive rather than negative until I started experiencing the continental European ones. So what I would like to know is, from the point of view of a liberal democracy, what is there a possibility to limit the power of these courts? Is there a possibility to limit the checks on the executives without losing what is called, from these perspectives, without losing one's, let's say, liberal blessings? Because, for example, where would this then place the United Kingdom, where Parliament is sovereign, and Parliament, if it wants, can override the courts, even when it seems to have forgotten, but it can. Where does it put? How does it? How does this liberal manichaeistic view deal with these different judicial traditions? Thank you.
Yeah, two very, 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 very big questions, and I'm tempted to lecture on both of them, but that I know I cannot without driving you all crazy, because there will be also other questions. Let me maybe start in reverse order. I think there is usually, or there has been maybe, a way of limiting these courts, and that was mainly self-limitation in a certain sense. And here comes this idea of auto-limitation into play, which has been developed in the literature on constitutional courts and their relationship with politics. Because usually, of course, politics would like to avoid that they will be ruled down, so to speak, by a constitutional court. But the constitutional court would also like to avoid that politics is ignoring its rulings. And so the constitutional court is an actor with, as I think it was, who was it? Who said that? An actor without a sword and a purse? Was it Franklin? Or so there is this saying, in a way, the constitutional court is a powerless actor, because its only power comes from compliance. And if that compliance is in question, then this would undermine the position of the court. So in usual politics, you will have a kind of mutual anticipation of the action of the others. So politics would like to anticipate. So this is the law of anticipatory reaction. It would like to anticipate what a court would say. But the court would, in its ruling, always also like to anticipate what politics will do with its ruling. So usually, in a functioning democracy, you would have some kind of mutual self-regulation of that relation. In a way, that gets out of balance if you have a transnational legal system, where there is no political vis-a-vis, and that, I think, that's the drama of Europe in a certain sense, because there the incentives for auto-limitation are simply absent. So I could continue talking about Supreme Court versus Constitutional Court, but I leave it at that for a moment. So the militant democracy stuff is, again, it's a huge issue. I would like to argue that, in a way, how do you say? In a way, it's a complete.
Maybe we could say in one sentence what militant democracy is to help the audience. It's the idea that instead of democracy, it's targeting the enemies of democracy in an assertive way. So this idea came from the mid-20th century. It was pushed by people such as Karl Mannheim. They said something like Nazi Germany can never happen again. Hitler took power, from within a democratic system. Democratic systems cannot allow the enemies of democracy to rise up within a democracy, and therefore you have to hunt down those enemies of democracy. You cannot say, oh yeah, they have their own party. We allow that freedom of speech, democratic civil society. No, you target them. So that's the idea of militant democracy, and this has been Stefano argued this become more influential in the European Commission, and it's been very influential in West Germany, and then the Bundesrepublik in the 90s and early 21st century. Sorry for the interjection.
Yes, and in a way, I would say you don't have to be adherent of Karl Löwenstein or Karl Mannheim to buy into that notion of militant democracy, but so as long as you see a constitution as the expression of the political will of a community, then of course there is very, very good reason to defend that constitution against its enemies. The problem is a little bit with how and to what extent and with what instruments. So coming from Germany, Germany is an extreme example of that. We have very, very powerful constitutional court for a long time. It was the one single court on the whole globe which was so powerful. We have the possibility to how do you say Parteiverbot, so to prohibit. To ban party bans, which is also quite exceptional if you look at Western Europe. And then we have this extremely well-staffed and well-financed Verfassungsschutz. So there's this internal Constitution Protection Agency. So really tracking each and every check protocol of parties, whether something unconstitutional has been voiced, yes or no. So the German case is extreme in that. But I think if you really look now at what has been called the Article 2 revolution, where as far as Stefan Auer, of course, is a much, much better person to say that, because he's much more, he knows much better what that is. But if you see from the Portuguese judgment, so the judgment on the Portuguese judges of the European Court of Justice, and putting now the Article 2 into this kind of instrument to discipline and punish through legal means, and to reverse the chain of legitimacy from the member states to the European Union, now from the European Union, from the treaties to the member states, then you see the dangers which are in there in this notion.
I don't have too much to add, but what you presented, Professor Manow, that there is this bias that there can't be too much liberalism in liberal democracy. That is exactly the problem with the concept of militant democracy. Circumstances matter a great deal, right? So the concept as a whole is pretty makes perfect sense, and also in the context of Germany and German history, absolutely makes perfect sense. But you already mentioned it's about how and to what extent, right? And I think it's been massively overused, and it's both unproductive and illegitimate. And that takes me to your to also Eric's point about the European Parliament attempting to discipline and punish de facto also the people of Hungary, not just the Hungarian government, right? Again, it's profoundly misguided and counterproductive. I personally think that Hungarian democracy has problems, and I think it is in the nature of all democracies that they have problems, and there are no obvious solutions to them. But the solutions should come from within Hungarian society, because if there is attempt made to impose them by the supranational technocratic political bodies, the most likely outcome is that they will backfire, right? So that is also then the limit of this notion of militant democracy, and overall the use of non-majoritarian organizations to fix the problems of democracy. In the end, you lose democracy that you are meant to be protecting. And also what you said about the self-limitation and this kind of dialogical relationship between the government and the constitutional courts. In a well-functioning system, they work together. There is another example in economic policies where the creation of the European Central Bank is a complete, they created an institution that led to dysfunction that resulted in the Eurozone, because you have this supranational institution with immense powers and no counteracting body, right? The Bundesbank in Germany had very strong power, but it acted in conjunction or against the government. There was a kind of dialogical relationship which at the European level you don't have. So there is a very genuine threat of technocracy, and then to use the concept of militant democracy in a similar way, I think it's both counterproductive and illegitimate and unhelpful. I would just make one more point, citing this dear friend of mine, Martin Krieger, a constitutional scholar at UNSW University in Sydney in Australia, who said that law is too important to be left just to judges. It's the political community that needs to maintain the rule of law, right, and the support. And you mentioned the United Kingdom. You mentioned it, Stefan. And to me, that is a marvelous example. That's a Burkean example of how the rule of law can endure over centuries without a constitutional court, and arguably that system has proved way more robust than the German system or any system in continental Europe. So there is no inbuilt suspicion of the people, because the parliament is indeed sovereign, or it's the queen in parliament that is, the king in parliament that is sovereign. So I am all in favor of considering circumstances and thinking about the extent to which these concepts are used. But thanks, brilliant question.
Father Mario, my American colleague, who is also based in Florence, but also here with us in Budapest. Please go ahead, Father Mario.
An open question, maybe two questions. Eric, you mentioned that at the beginning, different levels of democracy or something to the effect. Within the EU or European Union, who determines what democracy actually is? Okay? And on what? Second, because it really seems, and if I can just follow up on my colleague with militant democracy, it really seems that here, and mentioned Carl Schmitt, who seems to be a prophet, when he talked about the Presbyterian democracy. The very fact he was very, very pessimistic about parliamentary democracy. He said, basically, for example, to use a present example, President Donald Trump is elected, but yet the checks and balances tend to be dispensed from keeping him in check. This is what it seems, what is happening in the European Union, with Hungary, the very fact that can't even exercise its own principle of subsidiarity. The Commission just keeps pounding and pounding. So I was wondering if you can perhaps comment on the first one, who determines democracy, what it is, and then the second one.
Do you have a favor? To whom are you asking this question? Professor Manow or Professor Auer? Both.
Maybe I start for a change. And for Carl Schmitt, I find the definition is very succinct description of sovereignty, quite compelling and very timely, right? Sovereign is the one who decides on the exception, right? That's the answer to the question of who decides. It's the sovereign. And the description is succinct, but it also opens up questions, because then it's tested in real life. But that is the question for Europeans today. Like, we didn't talk much about the war against Ukraine, the threat of Russia, but like the attempt made now at the EU level to say that the EU, you know, will have a European army and will defend European democracies or democracy in Europe. I think that's a non-starter, and it's nonsensical, because you don't have a political community of that kind at the European level, right? And that question is no longer just theoretical, it's very real, right? Or President Macron offering to extend the nuclear shield across the whole of Europe. And then when he is asked, it turns out that it will remain the French nuclear shield, because President Macron will be the one to decide on the exception. And that is truly an exceptional situation that can lead to the destruction of humanity, to have the power of the nuclear weapon. And again, that was a kind of theoretical consideration 10 years ago, and unfortunately, it is not anymore, right? So I'm inclined to say that only political communities, viable political communities, which to my mind exist at national level, can have the final say as to what constitutes democracy. As much as the Commission or courts are trying to usurp that authority, they do not have legitimacy. They do not have also democratic legitimacy to pass that judgments, those judgments.
And scholars, you mentioned that you were listing all these entities that do not have the authority to define democracy in a true sense, but to that you could add the scholars with their evaluative, interpretive schemes and frameworks and their democracy indices. Please go ahead, Professor Manow.
Sovereign is he who has the micro in his hand. So, yeah, I'm not completely sure whether I got the question right, but the point I would like to highlight is that, so there is this famous article by William Galli in the 1950s, and I think Eric alluded to it in his introduction, that democracy is an essentially contested concept, meaning that however long we would talk about it, we will never get to an agreement what democracy is. Because in a way, democracy is part of the political, and the political is the constant pluralism of perspective, the constant pluralism of interests. And since the interests are so diverse, since we are so diverse, the understanding of democracy itself is diverse and always itself at the center of contestation itself. So a majority would like majority rules, a minority would like to have checks and balances, and so on. So you could really. So I think this is a very important point, because it opens up. First of all, it warns us against essentializing the concept, and it warns us against to treating it ahistoric and to treating it independent from societal conflict, and it also warns us against equating certain values with democracy and then trying to, in a very abstract manner, to derive from certain values what we then understand as democracy. It would help us to say, okay, it's always changing. It's an always changing thing. It's an always moving target. Not only in the sense that it never will be achieved, but in the sense that we will never agree on it. But once we see this, it becomes clear that we have to historize democracy. So in order to understand which kind of epochs, which kind of time periods, out of which reasons understood democracy in that and that sense. And that's what I've tried to do in my talk, saying, okay, this notion of liberal democracy is, if we look at it, a very recent one. And it comes in a concrete time period. We can we can point to the time period where it emerges and where it gets plausibility, and we can give the reason why it gets plausibility around that time, because why it becomes hegemonic around that time. And I would say it's the time where the concept already tries to react to populism and saying, okay, if the Orbans of the world are elected, and these are free and fair election, if the Trumps of these worlds are elected, and in our view these are the destroyers of democracy, we then have to invent, or we then have to conceptualize democracy differently. Then there must be something superior, or something more benign, or something more, and then that's what we call liberal democracy, so that you can see that the measurement itself is already reacting to a concrete political constellation. And I think that's very important, that we move away from abstract notions and more understand the specific time period in which these concepts emerge, and why they emerge, and why certain groups find them attractive and others not so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Manow. Yes, so the conceptions of democracy do not, appear out of nowhere as mathematical abstractions. They are concrete responses in history, in political context, to counter-conceptions. They are polemical concepts. On that note, we have to end very sharply now in a punctual way, because I'm jumping in a taxi to the airport to go to Korea, where the Danube Institute is establishing connections to a number of conservative think tanks in Seoul. And in the conservatives in Korea are also in their own battle over the meaning of democracy. And one of the latest events in Korean politics has been that President Yoon, the conservative president, has been arrested, convicted, and put in jail. So that's one of the more dramatic scenes in the battle over the meaning of democracy by a constitutional court. So this would be the phrase I would like to end with. Wherever there is democracy, there is the battle over the meaning of democracy. Please give a round of applause to our speakers.